bus, ride a train, or catch a tram without ever reaching into your pocket. No tickets, no payments, no barriers. Just walk in and go. It almost sounds like a utopian dream, doesn't it? For most of the world, public transportation is a daily transaction, a small but constant financial exchange. But in one tiny European nation, something extraordinary happened. The government made all public transport absolutely free. That country is Luxembourg. In March 2020, Luxembourg became the first country in the world to implement a completely fare-free national public transport system. No other nation had attempted something on this scale. Buses, trains, and trams, all accessible to residents and tourists alike, without a single euro spent on tickets. It was celebrated by many as a revolutionary step towards social equality, environmental sustainability, and modern governance. International media declared it a bold move, a progressive leap into the future. But the real question remains, is it truly free? And more importantly, what does free actually mean in a system that still costs millions to operate? To answer that, we must peel back the surface of this feel-good headline, because beneath the layers of celebration lies a more complex reality, one of hidden costs, silent trade-offs, and economic ripples that stretch far beyond the ticket machines that no longer exist. This story isn't just about buses and metros. It's about how governments define priorities, how citizens pay for what they use, and how something that looks like a gift may come with an invisible invoice. To understand why Luxembourg decided to scrap all public transport fares, you need to look deeper than just convenience or kindness. This wasn't a random act of generosity. It was a political decision, strategic, symbolic, and highly calculated. In a country of just over 650,000 people, where nearly half the workforce commutes from neighboring nations daily, transportation had become more than just a service. It had become a pressure point. The capital, Luxembourg City, is often ranked among Europe's most congested urban centers. Traffic snarls stretch endlessly during peak hours, fueled by both domestic travelers and thousands of cross-border commuters. From France, Germany, and Belgium, as car ownership soared. Public transport, though present, was often seen as too expensive or too inconvenient to be a real alternative. Environmentalists warned of rising CO levels, while working-class families struggled to afford monthly passes. Something had to give. Then came the 2018 national elections. The ruling coalition, eager to show progressivism, offered a radical promise: make public transport free for everyone. It was simple, bold, and instantly popular. Politicians argued that this would reduce traffic, help the environment, and most importantly, level the economic playing field for lower-income citizens. Within months of re-election, they made good on that promise. But let's not pretend this was purely altruistic. Free transport was also a form of soft power, a way for Luxembourg to signal its wealth, modernity, and moral leadership in Europe. After all, when you're one of the richest countries in the world per capita, giving away transport sounds less like a sacrifice and more like a flex. It was a public relations win, a political trophy, and a shiny symbol of progress all rolled into one. Still, the promise was made. The fares were removed, and on paper, the plan worked. But what happened next wasn't as simple. When Luxembourg officially made public transport free, the world watched with a mix of admiration and skepticism. International media flocked to cover the story. Headlines painted it as a triumph, a country finally putting people before profit. On the ground, locals cheered. Tourists smiled at the idea of stress-free exploration. Politicians took victory laps. But what really changed for the everyday citizen? In the first few weeks, there was a noticeable uptick in ridership. Trams in. The capital saw more footfall. Buses ran fuller than usual. Even train stations had more activity, especially during weekends. On the surface, the policy seemed to be doing what it promised, making transportation more accessible. But dig deeper, and the cracks begin to show. For the working class, the psychological impact was significant. No more worrying about monthly tickets. No budgeting for daily commutes. For low-income families, it felt like a small form of justice, a recognition that even the poor deserve mobility. Yet, many quickly realized that while the ride was free, the infrastructure was still the same. The buses were still packed during rush hours, some routes were still inconsistent, rural areas still had long wait times or limited connections. In essence, the biggest flaw wasn't in the pricing, it was in the system's capacity. Free access brought more people, but without parallel investment in frequency. Coverage and quality, it only magnified existing weaknesses. Many wealthier residents who had always preferred cars didn't suddenly switch to public transport. After all, for them, the problem was never the fare. It was convenience, comfort, and control. And so, an unexpected split emerged. Public transport became more crowded, but not necessarily more efficient. The poor used it more, the rich still drove, and the roads remained congested. For some, the experience even got worse. Longer waits, less seating, more delays. The dream of free mobility was alive. But now it was being stress-tested by reality. Nothing in this world is truly free, and public transport is no exception. Trains don't run on goodwill. Buses aren't fueled by slogans. Behind every smooth ride and clean station lies an entire network of costs: fuel, maintenance, staff, salaries, infrastructure upgrades, and more. When Luxembourg scrapped ticket fees, those costs didn't vanish. They just shifted quietly and invisibly onto the shoulders of someone else. That someone was the taxpayer, the Luxembourgish. Government spends hundreds of millions of euros annually to maintain and operate its public transport system. Before the fare-free model, around 40 million euros came from ticket sales. It wasn't the majority, but it was something. When that revenue disappeared, it had to be replaced, not through magic, but through tax funds, mostly collected from residents and businesses. Critics pointed this out almost immediately. Free is a misleading term, they argued. It's not free, it's prepaid. Everyone is paying for it, whether they use it or not. And in some ways, that created a subtle tension. Wealthy car owners who rarely step on a bus were now indirectly subsidizing the travel of others, a country proud of its financial independence. This triggered quiet debates about fairness, but the government had its response ready. They argued that transport is a public good, like education or healthcare. It shouldn't be transactional, it should be universal. Their belief: a mobile population is a productive population. If giving everyone the freedom to move lifts the whole economy, then yes, it's worth paying for collectively. Still, the system wasn't flawless. There were bureaucratic challenges. More people using transport meant more wear and tear, more strain on staff, and a growing demand for upgrades. Yet the annual budget was still finite. Investment needed to rise, but tax hikes weren't politically popular. Something had to stretch or something had to break. And so, free came with fine print. The rides didn't cost a cent, but the system slowly began to feel the weight of expectations that weren't being matched by funding. One of the biggest arguments for free public transport was environmental. Luxembourg's leaders didn't just promise economic equality, they promised a greener future. They claimed that by making buses and trains free, people would ditch their cars, reduce traffic, and cut down emissions. It was a beautiful idea: clean air, quiet streets, and a healthier planet. But the truth is far more complicated. Luxembourg has one of the highest rates of car ownership in the European Union, nearly 700 cars per 1,000 people, and that number hasn't changed much since public transport became free. The problem wasn't just cost, it was culture. For many in Luxembourg, cars are more than transportation. They're a symbol of independence, comfort, and social status. Especially in suburban and rural areas, where transport connections are weaker, people still prefer to drive. Why? Because even if the ride is free, it's not always faster, more reliable, or more convenient, in fact. Studies showed that most of the increase in public transport usage came from people who were already using it: students, elderly citizens, and low-income residents. Very few car owners made the switch. The roads remained busy, traffic persisted, and emissions, it barely dipped. This led to an uncomfortable realization. Free public transport doesn't automatically mean greener cities. Without a dramatic shift in infrastructure, urban planning, and behavior, the impact stays limited. What's needed isn't just zero fares, it's zero excuses to drive. That means better service frequency, more integrated routes, bike-sharing programs, co-restriction zones, and serious incentives to leave the car at home. In that sense, Luxembourg's model became a lesson. Yes, public transport should be accessible. Yes, the environment matters. But unless you make the alternative better, not just cheaper, people won't change their habits. Free is a start, but it's not the finish line. When fares vanished, expectations soared. People believed that free meant better, faster service, cleaner stations, more buses on the road. But behind the wheel and inside the control rooms, things weren't so simple. Public transport systems are like living organisms. The more pressure you put on them, the more they creak and groan, and Luxembourg's was no exception. Almost immediately, ridership jumped. That was expected. What wasn't expected was how quickly the system began to feel stretched. Drivers found themselves handling more passengers per shift. Platforms became more crowded, especially during peak hours. Small issues like delays, missed stops, or equipment failures became big frustrations when repeated across thousands of daily trips. Staff morale became a concern. Conductors and drivers weren't given immediate reinforcements, even though their workload had increased. Cleaning crews had more foot traffic to manage, but not always more resources. Some routes became unpredictable. Even the infrastructure stations, buses, rail cars, faced faster wear and tear than budgeted for. And since no one was paying at the door, something else changed too. The sense of value. While most people appreciated the service, a small but growing segment began to treat it carelessly. Vandalism and disruptive behavior rose in certain areas. Not dramatically, but enough to raise alarms. In any system where a price tag disappears, the perceived worth sometimes goes with it. This created a difficult balancing act for authorities. How do you maintain quality when you've removed the financial input of the users? How do you expand a system without expanding its budget at the same pace? The government was now under constant pressure to fund not just operations, but improvements, expansions, repairs, and crisis response. Free public transport had changed the rules of the game, but it hadn't changed the resources. The result? A growing gap between what people expected and what the system could actually deliver. Luxembourg's bold move didn't just catch headlines, it caught attention across borders. Around the world, city planners, politicians, and policy nerds watched closely. Could this tiny nation be the model for something bigger? Could free public transport be the future of urban mobility? As the idea echoed through global conferences and government meetings, reactions split into three camps: the dreamers, the pragmatists, and the skeptics. First, the dreamers. Countries like Estonia had already dipped their toes in similar waters. Tallinn, its capital, had launched free public transport for residents back in 2013, long before Luxembourg. They even claimed economic growth as a result. Other cities, like Dunkirk in France and Chengdu in China, began testing their own pilot programs. Politicians loved the headlines. Free was politically sexy. It made for great campaigns and bold promises. Then came the pragmatists. These were the cities that loved the idea but feared the cost. Places like Vienna, Seoul, and Toronto studied the data and asked harder questions. Would it actually reduce car usage? Who would pay for the funding gap? Could we afford to upgrade the system while also removing its revenue? For many of these places, the answer was a hesitant no. They preferred partial subsidies, like discounted fares for students or the elderly, rather than wiping out the ticket system entirely. And then, the skeptics. These were the officials and analysts who warned that Luxembourg's model couldn't be exported so easily. Her logic was blunt. Luxembourg is rich, small, and politically stable. Its population is lower than many major cities. Its wealth allows experiments others simply can't afford. What works for 650,000 people might fall apart with 6 million. Their argument wasn't against public transport. It was against illusion. The illusion that one model fits all. It's the illusion that copying a headline guarantees the same result. And most of all, the illusion that making something free removes its cost. Still, the conversation had changed. Luxembourg had lit a match, and around the world the fire was spreading. Not as policy, always, but as a question. A challenge to the status quo. Maybe, just maybe, the way we think about transport as a service you buy instead of a right you deserve was shifting. On the surface, the idea of free public transport seems perfect for developing nations. In countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, or the Philippines, where millions struggle to afford even basic commutes, offering free rides could change lives. Imagine a system where daily wage laborers can reach work without losing a chunk of their income, where students from remote areas can attend school without worrying about bus fares, where the elderly can move with dignity and mothers can carry their children safely across the city. It's a beautiful vision, but is it realistic? The reality is harder, Johnny. Much harder. Developing nations face a brutal truth. Their transport systems aren't just underfunded, they're broken in many places. Buses are overcrowded, old, and sometimes unsafe. Rail networks are outdated, routes are limited, corruption eats away at resources, and urban planning is often reactive, not visionary. Making such systems free wouldn't solve the core issues, it might even make them worse. Because here's the thing, when a weak system becomes free, it collapses faster. Crowds increase, maintenance drops, staff become overworked, and without ticket revenue, governments must either raise taxes, borrow money, or cut corners. In countries where budgets are already tight, this becomes a dangerous cycle. And yet, there's still a lesson here. Instead of going fully free, developing countries can adopt targeted subsidies, free or discounted transport for the poorest. The disabled, students, and senior citizens, they can focus on modernizing infrastructure first. Electric buses, digital ticketing, better routes, and most of all, they can treat public transport not as a forgotten utility, but as a national priority like education or healthcare. In Karachi, Mumbai, Dhaka, people don't need luxury. They need reliability, safety, affordability, and maybe one day, as economies grow and systems improve, fare-free travel can become more than a dream. But for now, the question isn't whether we can make transport free, it's whether we can make it work. So what have we learned? Luxembourg's bold experiment showed us that free is never just about money. It's about choices, who pays, who benefits, and what gets sacrificed in the process. On paper, the idea of fare-free public transport, it's elegant, it's hopeful, it feels like justice. But in the real world, it's messier, heavier, and far more complicated. The truth is, free public transport isn't a miracle solution. It doesn't automatically clean the air, solve poverty, or empty the roads. It doesn't fix a broken system, it only tests it harder. And while it offers dignity to the poor and signals progress to the world, it also puts quiet pressure on taxpayers, staff, and infrastructure. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the word free has been misunderstood. We think it means without cost, but in truth, it means without burden at the point of use. It means shifting responsibility from the individual to the collective, from the pocket to the policy. And in that shift, there's power. Because what Luxembourg proved, despite its flaws, despite its critics, is that a nation can decide to treat mobility as a right, not a privilege. It can choose to build systems that prioritize people over profit. And it can force the world to ask better questions, not just about transport, but about how we value public services. So, is free public transport really free? No, but maybe it's not supposed to be. maybe it's just the first step in a much bigger journey. A journey toward a world where freedom of movement isn't determined by the weight of your wallet, but by the strength of our shared vision. Because in the end, the most valuable ticket is the one you never have to think about it all.